Okay, so in the previous lesson, we saw how we could query the DOM with methods like getElementById. And in this lesson, I want to show you how we can also use JavaScript to create new HTML elements and actually add them to the DOM as if they were just regular HTML elements written in an HTML file. The beauty here, of course, is that we're going to use JavaScript to programmatically add these elements to our user interface. So first up, in our index.html file, let's go ahead and remove this hello text right here. So now we have an empty div on our page. And my goal in our console in Chrome will be to create a new paragraph HTML element, to give it some inner text, to give it some actual text content that it's containing, to give it a sample CSS class name, and then to add it to this div, which currently exists only in our index.html file. So right here on the right-hand side, I'm once again going to bring up our console. So right-click, inspect, and I'm going to navigate to the console right here. And we saw in the previous lesson that we have a document object available in our browser. One of its methods is getElementById. Another one of its methods is called createElement. And as you might guess, this allows us to create an HTML element, but represented as a JavaScript DOM node. So here we can provide a string representing the HTML element that we want to create. In this case, I'm going to provide a string with a lowercase p, which will represent an HTML p tag, a paragraph tag. Now, when I execute this, nothing is going to appear on the screen because remember, this DOM node representing a p tag does not yet exist in our actual user interface. It exists as this JavaScript object that is kind of floating along in our console independent of the user interface. But we have an object representing an eventual DOM node, an eventual thing that will be part of our user interface in just a second. So because this is a valid JavaScript object, we can do JavaScript things to it, like assign it to a variable. So I'm just going to press the up key to get our previous line, and I'm going to assign it to a const called paragraph. So now we have an object referenced by our paragraph constant, and that object is going to have properties and methods on it. Well, one of the properties on this node object is text content. We saw this in the previous lesson with our div. It also exists on a node representing a p element. And here we can provide a string and overwrite this property. And this is going to represent the text content inside that is nested as a child of the paragraph tag. So this is going to be the thing that appears after the opening p tag and before the closing p tag. So right here, I can add an arbitrary string like once upon a time. So now once again, we see nothing on the screen, but we are building up this JavaScript object representation of something that will be on the screen in just a moment. Similarly, I can take my paragraph object. It has a class name property, and I'm going to assign that the CSS class that I want to add to this paragraph, or this object representing a paragraph to be more specific. Let's say I want to give that CSS class name a name of red text. It's totally arbitrary, both for text content and class name. So now I have this paragraph, and I can output it down below by simply printing paragraph. So you can see what this would look like if we were to add it to our actual elements on the page. We can see a p tag, the class of red text, and the text content inside of once upon a time. It doesn't exist right here. There's nowhere where we've told the browser to put it, but it kind of exists as this independent paragraph that's just floating off in JavaScript world, right? So now I want to inject it right in the middle of this div with an ID of root. So just like in the previous lesson, what we can do is we can declare a const. I'm going to call it root element, and I'm going to use the document object once again and its getElementById method, and I'm going to query the DOM for the element that has an ID of root. And that, of course, is going to get us the root element, which is our div with an ID of root. It doesn't have any content or any nested children. That's why it occupies 0 height. It's not visible, but it is this thing right here, or equivalently this thing right here. All right, so now we have that real world element that is part of our user interface stored in a JavaScript constant. And we have this separate element representing a p tag that exists just in JavaScript world. And obviously the next thing we want to do is make this p part of the actual user interface. So on our root element, which represents our div, for any node, there's going to be a method called appendChild. And what that's going to do is accept another node, and it's going to make that DOM node the child, or in other words, the nested content of the DOM node that the method is called upon. So because we're calling appendChild on our div, we're specifying what we want to inject between the opening div tag and the closing div tag. We're basically using JavaScript to specify what we want to add right here where my cursor is in VS Code. And of course, the node that I want to append as a child of the div is my paragraph node that I created above that is referenced by my paragraph constant. So once I add that, take a look at what's going to happen. Voila, it exists on the screen, right? So here in Elements, we can see that within our div, we have added that paragraph node with a class of red text with a class name of red text with text content of once upon a time. And here it is appearing in our actual user interface. So even though we did not have this content in our HTML file when we started, we used plain JavaScript to create functionality that allowed us to create an element and add it to the DOM, to the user interface. So we are not using React yet, but this is just to demonstrate that these functionalities already exist in the browser. What React is ultimately going to do for us is do something very similar to this, but with its own additional layer of abstraction called JSX. But these functionalities, these features exist in our browser, and they've existed in our browser for a very long time. The key takeaway is the DOM provides us programmatic ways. All that programmatic means is we're able to do it with JavaScript, right? The DOM provides us with programmatic ways to read elements, write elements, inspect elements, change elements, interact with them using a programming language, right? These are all very simple contrived examples, but they're hopefully starting to demonstrate that we don't necessarily need to start with HTML. We can just start with JavaScript and have that do all the work. We start with a very blank template and have JavaScript simply take over and add children, for example, to this div and build up a complete user interface. Obviously, it would require potentially hundreds of nodes, and that could be a very laborious process to do right here, but it's all technically possible with JavaScript. All right, that's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.